Ricky Gervais walked onto the set of Loose Women expecting a friendly conversation. The famous comedian was there to talk about his latest stand-up special. He was known for his quick wit and honest approach to comedy. The studio audience clapped as he made his way to the panel, smiling and waving at everyone. He sat down in his chair and adjusted his microphone as the cameras got ready to start filming. Denise Welch sat across from him with her arms already folded. Before Ricky could even finish saying hello to the other women on the panel, Denise jumped straight into her questions. Her tone was sharp right from the start. She asked Ricky if his comedy had been called offensive by many people. She wanted to know if he enjoyed hurting people's feelings. The audience suddenly became quiet. Ricky blinked, clearly surprised by such an aggressive opening question. He let out a small laugh, trying to make the mood lighter. He said that was quite a way to start an interview. He explained that he thought comedy was supposed to challenge people and make them think. He didn't set out to hurt anyone. He wanted to make people laugh, and sometimes that meant touching on uncomfortable topics. Denise wasn't satisfied with his answer. She shook her head like she was dismissing what he said. She asked if he understood that words have consequences. Her voice got a bit louder. She said he couldn't just say whatever he wanted and hide behind the label of comedy. Ricky nodded slowly, still trying to keep things civil and friendly. He said of course words have consequences, but he thought there was a difference between making a joke and actually advocating for harm. Context mattered, intent mattered. One of the other women on the panel tried to interrupt and steer the conversation toward Ricky's new special, but Denise spoke over her. Denise declared that intent doesn't matter if people are offended. She said if someone tells you they're hurt by what you said, that's the end of the discussion. You apologize and move on. The audience remained quiet, sensing the tension building in the room. Ricky shifted in his seat. His expression became more serious. He said respectfully that he disagreed. He thought people could have conversations about why something might be offensive without immediately shutting down all discussion. Comedy had always pushed boundaries. That was part of its purpose. Denise let out an exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes dramatically. She said this was exactly the problem with people like him. She waved her hand dismissively. She asked if he thought he was above criticism. Did he think his fame gave him the right to say whatever he wanted without consequences? Ricky's jaw tightened. His friendly manner was starting to crack under the weight of Denise's relentless attacks. He repeated her words, people like me, and asked in a steady but firm voice what exactly she meant by that. Denise leaned back in her chair with a smug expression on her face. She said she meant privileged men who had never faced real consequences for their actions. Men who thought they could joke about anything and everyone should just accept it because they were famous. The audience gasped. Another woman on the panel tried to intervene again, but Denise wasn't finished talking. She continued, saying that he sat there in his bubble making millions while regular people suffered the consequences of the attitudes he promoted. She said frankly, it was disgusting. Ricky raised his eyebrows and took a deep breath before responding. He said that he came there to talk about his work. He didn't come to be lectured about privilege or to be called disgusting. If she wanted to have an actual conversation about comedy and its role in society, he would be happy to do that. But this felt like an ambush. Denise scoffed loudly. She repeated the word ambush, mockingly. She said this was a conversation. If he couldn't handle being questioned about his choices, maybe he shouldn't be in the public eye. The other women on the panel looked increasingly uncomfortable. One of them attempted to change the subject entirely by asking Ricky about his creative process. But Denise immediately spoke over her again. She insisted they needed to address this. The public deserved to know what kind of person they were supporting when they bought tickets to his shows. Ricky's expression hardened. He looked directly at Denise and asked what kind of person he was. Since she seemed to have him all figured out, he wanted to know. Denise didn't hesitate. She listed things off, counting on her fingers. Self-centered, arrogant, someone who valued laughs over human decency. Someone who thought being clever gave them permission to punch down at vulnerable people. The audience was completely silent now. You could hear a pin drop in the studio. Ricky sat perfectly still, processing what had just been said about him on live television. He said quietly that was quite an assessment. He asked what it was based on. The fact that he made jokes she didn't personally enjoy. Denise leaned forward again with her eyes narrowing. She said it was based on his body of work. Based on the countless complaints and articles written about his offensive material. Based on the fact that he clearly didn't care who he hurt as long as he got attention. Another woman on the panel tried desperately to intervene. She suggested gently that perhaps they could talk about the positive response Ricky had received as well. There were many people who appreciated his approach to comedy, but Denise cut her off with a sharp gesture. She declared that those people were part of the problem. Anyone who found this kind of humor funny needed to take a hard look at themselves. Ricky let out a short, incredulous laugh. He said so now she was attacking his audience too. Everyone who enjoyed his work was part of some problem. Denise crossed her arms again. Her posture was defensive despite being on the attack. She said if they were laughing at jokes that demeaned others, then yes, absolutely they were part of the problem. Ricky looked around at the other women on the panel and then at the camera, as if searching for some sign that this was all a joke. When he realized it wasn't, he turned back to Denise. He said he had tried to have a respectful conversation there, but she had made it very clear that she had no interest in actually talking with him. She invited him on the show to belittle him and his work. Denise's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her aggressive stance. She corrected him, saying she invited him on the show to hold him accountable, something that clearly didn't happen enough in his world. Ricky nodded slowly with a sad smile crossing his face. He asked accountable for what exactly? Making people laugh, creating entertainment that millions of people enjoyed, having opinions that differed from hers. Denise's voice rose sharply. She practically shouted that he needed to be accountable for spreading harmful ideas and normalizing attitudes that hurt real people. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Ricky took a moment, clearly trying to decide how to respond. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but filled with disappointment. He said he genuinely felt sorry for her. He felt sorry that she saw the world through such a narrow lens that she couldn't distinguish between actual harm and someone simply having a different sense of humor than her. Denise's face turned red with anger. She snapped at him not to dare patronize her. She didn't need his pity. What she needed was for people like him to take responsibility for the damage they caused. Ricky stood up slowly and removed his microphone. He asked what damage. His voice was filled with genuine confusion. Could she give him one specific example of damage he had caused? One person whose life had been ruined by one of his jokes. Denise sputtered, clearly not expecting this direct challenge. She argued it wasn't about specific examples. It was about the overall culture he contributed to. Ricky shook his head. He said simply that she couldn't provide an example. She had spent the last several minutes attacking his character, calling him disgusting, self-centered, and arrogant. But she couldn't actually point to any real harm he had done. One of the other women finally managed to get a word in. She suggested nervously that perhaps they should take a break. But both Ricky and Denise ignored her. Denise insisted that the harm was in the normalization. The harm was in making people think it was okay to laugh at certain topics. Ricky placed his microphone on the chair. He said in a neutral tone, so it was thought police then. She wanted to control what people were allowed to find funny. Denise stood up as well with her face contorted with anger. She shouted that she wanted people to think before they spoke. She wanted people to consider the impact of their words. Was that really so terrible? Ricky looked at her with what appeared to be genuine sadness. He said no, that wasn't terrible. But attacking someone, making personal judgments about their character and refusing to have an actual dialogue, that was terrible. That wasn't how people had productive conversations about difficult topics. Denise pointed an accusatory finger at him. She hissed at him not to lecture her about productive conversations. He had made a career out of being provocative. He lived for controversy. Ricky let out a long breath. He corrected her, saying he lived for making people laugh. Yes, sometimes that involved being provocative. But there was a difference between challenging ideas and attacking people personally, which was what she had done there that day. The other women on the panel sat frozen, unsure how to proceed. The audience remained silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Denise's voice took on a mocking tone. She said with exaggerated sympathy, "Oh, poor Ricky, he couldn't handle a little criticism." She thought he was all about free speech and saying whatever he wanted. Ricky smiled sadly. He said he was about free speech, which was why he wasn't trying to stop her from saying these things, even though they were unfair and based on assumptions rather than facts. But free speech also meant he was free to walk away from a conversation that was clearly going nowhere. Denise's expression turned smug. She taunted him, saying he was running away when things got uncomfortable. How very brave of him. Ricky picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. He said calmly that he wasn't running away. He was choosing not to participate in a conversation where one person had already decided that nothing he said would matter. She didn't bring him there to talk. She brought him there to grandstand. Denise laughed harshly. She said she brought him there to answer for his actions. But clearly he was too much of a coward to do that. The word coward seemed to hang in the air. Ricky stopped moving and looked at Denise with an expression of disbelief. He repeated the word slowly. A coward. Because he wouldn't sit there and accept baseless accusations about his character. Because he wouldn't let her bully him on national television. Denise's voice dripped with sarcasm. She said incredulously that she was bullying him. He was a rich, famous man. He couldn't be bullied. Ricky shook his head. He said quietly that anyone could be bullied. Wealth and fame didn't make someone immune to being treated poorly. And that was exactly what had happened there that day. One of the other women tried once more to salvage the situation. She offered hopefully that maybe they could start over and take a different approach to the conversation. But Ricky was already putting on his jacket. He said he appreciated the offer, but he didn't think that would help. This wasn't about having a difficult conversation. This was about one person wanting to make an example of someone else. Denise crossed her arms tightly. She warned him that if he left, everyone would know he couldn't handle the heat. Ricky paused and looked at her one more time. He said simply to let them think what they wanted. He knew why he was leaving. He was leaving because he had too much respect for himself to sit there and be verbally abused. He was leaving because this wasn't a conversation or an interview. It was a trial where she had already decided he was guilty. Denise's voice turned cold. She said he was proving her point. He could dish it out, but he couldn't take it. Ricky smiled without humor. He explained patiently that there was a difference between dishing it out and taking it. In his work, he made observations and jokes. Sometimes they were provocative. But he wasn't personally attacking individuals. He wasn't calling specific people disgusting or self-centered or arrogant. What she had done that day was fundamentally different from anything he did in his comedy. The producer's voice could be heard faintly through someone's earpiece, likely trying to figure out what to do about the situation. Denise wasn't backing down. She accused him of hiding behind the word comedy. At least she had the courage to say what she meant directly. Ricky nodded thoughtfully. He agreed that she did say what she meant directly, and what she meant was hurtful and unfair. She was entitled to her opinion of his work. She was entitled to dislike his comedy. But she wasn't entitled to make sweeping judgments about who he was as a person based on her interpretation of his work. Denise took a step toward him. She insisted that she was entitled to call out bad behavior when she saw it. Ricky held up a hand. He countered that he was entitled to leave when someone was being hostile and unreasonable, which was what was happening right then. The other women exchanged worried glances. The audience remained completely silent, captivated by the confrontation but clearly uncomfortable. Denise's voice became shrill. She exclaimed that this was exactly why they needed to have these conversations. Because people like him thought they could just walk away when they were challenged. Ricky turned to face her fully one last time. He said with his voice firm but not angry that he wasn't walking away from a challenge. He was walking away from abuse. There was a significant difference. A challenge would involve questions, dialogue, and mutual respect. What she had offered that day was none of those things. Denise opened her mouth to respond, but Ricky continued. He said she had spent the entire time attacking him personally. She had made assumptions about his character, his motivations, and his values. She had called him names and questioned his decency as a human being. And when he had tried to respond thoughtfully, she had talked over him and dismissed everything he said. One of the other women nodded slightly, clearly agreeing with Ricky's assessment. Denise's face was now bright red with anger and perhaps embarrassment. She repeated her earlier point, saying if he couldn't handle criticism, he shouldn't be famous. Ricky sighed deeply. He said warily that this wasn't criticism. Criticism would be discussing specific jokes or bits and explaining why she found them problematic. Criticism would be having a nuanced conversation about the role of comedy in society. What she had done was launch a personal attack, and then claimed it was criticism when he objected. Denise pointed at him accusingly. She declared that he was just upset because someone finally stood up to him. Ricky smiled sadly again. He said people stood up to him all the time. He read critical reviews. He engaged with people who disagreed with him on social media. He had had many thoughtful conversations with people who found aspects of his work challenging. But those conversations involved respect and good faith. This had been neither respectful nor in good faith. The studio was now filled with an oppressive silence. Even the crew seemed frozen, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the scene play out. Denise's voice dropped to a bitter whisper that was still picked up by the microphones. She said venomously that he thought he was better than everyone else. Ricky looked genuinely puzzled by this accusation. He replied that he didn't think he was better than anyone, but he did think he deserved basic respect just like everyone else, and he wasn't receiving that there that day. He looked at the camera briefly, then back at Denise. He said simply that he wished her well. He hoped she found whatever it was she was looking for in this conversation. But he was done. Denise let out a harsh laugh. She said mockingly that of course he was done. He should run back to his echo chamber where everyone told him how brilliant he was. Ricky paused at the edge of the set and turned back one final time. He said that was an interesting assumption, but the truth was, he was going back to a world where people could disagree without being disagreeable. Where people could have different opinions without resorting to personal attacks. Where conversation was actually possible. With those final words, Ricky Gervais walked off the Loose Women set. The cameras continued rolling as Denise stood there with her arms still crossed, watching him leave. The other women looked at each other awkwardly, clearly unsure how to proceed. Denise finally turned to the camera with her face still flushed. She said, trying to sound triumphant but coming across as defensive, that she thought that showed everyone exactly what kind of person he really was. But the audience's silence suggested they might have drawn a very different conclusion. One of the other women cleared her throat nervously. She suggested quietly that perhaps they should move on to their next segment as the show cut to commercial. The image of Denise's angry face and Ricky's empty chair told the whole story. What was supposed to be a routine interview had turned into one of the most awkward and hostile moments in daytime television history. The comedian had walked in expecting a friendly chat and walked out after being subjected to a barrage of personal attacks disguised as accountability. The host, who thought she was holding someone accountable, had instead revealed her own inability to have a civil conversation with someone whose work she disagreed with. The tension in that studio had been building from the very first question, escalating with each dismissive comment and personal accusation. What viewers had witnessed was not journalism or meaningful dialogue. It was one person's determination to attack another under the guise of asking tough questions. In the end, the person who walked away with dignity intact was the one who chose to leave rather than continue participating in what had become a hostile interrogation rather than an interview. Ricky had tried multiple times to have a reasonable discussion. He had attempted to explain his perspective on comedy and its purpose. He had remained calm even when being called disgusting and self-centered. He had asked for specific examples of harm he had caused, which Denise could not provide. He had given her multiple opportunities to change the tone of the conversation. But Denise had been determined from the beginning to make Ricky look bad. She wasn't interested in understanding his point of view. She wasn't interested in a dialogue. She had decided before he even sat down that he was guilty of spreading harmful ideas, and nothing he could say would change her mind. The other women on the panel had clearly been uncomfortable with how things were going. They had tried several times to redirect the conversation or offer Ricky a chance to discuss his actual work. But Denise had talked over them each time, refusing to let go of her attack. What made the whole situation even more uncomfortable was that Denise seemed to believe she was doing something righteous. She genuinely thought she was holding a powerful person accountable. But accountability requires fairness in facts. It requires listening as well as speaking. It requires being open to the possibility that your assumptions might be wrong. Denise had shown none of these qualities. Instead, she had demonstrated how not to conduct an interview. She had shown how personal bias can turn a conversation into an attack. She had proven that calling something accountability doesn't make it so. Ricky's decision to leave was not an act of cowardice, despite what Denise claimed. It was an act of self-respect. He recognized that nothing productive was going to come from staying. Denise had made up her mind about him, and no amount of explanation or discussion was going to change that. By walking away, Ricky sent a clear message. He would not accept being treated poorly, regardless of the platform or the circumstances. He would not sit there and be verbally abused just because someone claimed they were asking tough questions. He knew the difference between challenging questions and personal attacks, and he refused to pretend they were the same thing. The audience's silence throughout most of the confrontation spoke volumes. They weren't cheering Denise on. They weren't agreeing with her attacks. They were uncomfortable witnesses to something that should never have happened. A guest invited onto a show should be treated with basic courtesy and respect, even if the host disagrees with their work. In the days following the incident, many people discussed what had happened. Some praised Ricky for standing up for himself. Others defended Denise's right to ask hard questions. But most people who watched the actual exchange could see the difference between asking hard questions and launching personal attacks. The incident became a lesson in how not to conduct an interview. It showed that having a platform doesn't give someone the right to abuse their guests. It demonstrated that disagreement doesn't require disrespect, and it proved that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is recognize when a situation is beyond saving and walk away with their dignity intact. Ricky Gervais went into that studio prepared to talk about his work. He left having demonstrated something far more important than any comedy special. He showed that self-respect matters, that personal attacks dressed up as accountability are still personal attacks, and that no amount of fame or success means someone has to accept being treated poorly. The empty chair he left behind on that set represented more than just a failed interview. It represented a boundary that had been crossed and a person who refused to accept that crossing. It stood as a reminder that respect is earned through behavior, not demanded through position. And it symbolized the simple truth that sometimes walking away is the most powerful statement you can make.